ADA 30. Celebrating the Americans with Disabilities Act.
GCDD Legislative Advocacy Director Charlie Miller interviewed Mark Johnson, a renowned disability advocate and former Director of Advocacy at the Shepherd Center, on what it was like to advocate for the Americans with Disabilities Act, what the future holds, and his advice for young advocates.
What was your biggest quote, I can't believe I lived without this moment, once the ADA got passed?
The biggest moment. Well, like I say, I got injured in 1971. And so I became familiar with the Architectural Barriers Act of 68. And then after 71, I got involved in Section 504 of the Rehab Act, in the late 70s. But none of them were as broad as ADA. So, back in those days when I drive a modified or accessible van, and so back in those days, you didn't have really building codes that addressed access. So there were a lot of physical barriers. You weren't able to use public transit. Just a lot of issues. You weren't able to go down to Tybee Island and get on beach matting. You weren't able to, access power beach chairs in Orange Beach, Alabama, or Destin. You weren't able to do all those things. So you kind of did what you could do. So I think the aha moment or whatever, when I was sitting on the White House lawn in July 26, 1990 with 3,000 other people in very hot weather, obviously being July in DC.
Yeah.
Was that, you finally kind of got acknowledged as a person, not somebody to be treated differently or be discriminated against. So it was like, after all those years where people with disabilities were separated and isolated and discriminated against, it was like, okay, change takes time, but now we have a new tool in the toolkit, and that's ADA. So that was one thing, was just seeing that many people with that much history and understanding that a new narrative had started.
I think it's really important for us to highlight that, like you were saying, that ADA is there, but there are other laws and other things like the Olmstead decision that has really impacted our community.
And think about that. That didn't come along until like 9 years after ADA, but
yeah.
Well, I always had this theory, and I think I've told it to you before, if common sense worked, we wouldn't need laws. And so unfortunately we have to pass laws, but sometimes they don't go far enough. I mean, people who study history realize that, the law itself should have been enough in 90, but we had to go and sue the state of Georgia to enforce the law 9 years later, And if you look at the enforcement or implementation of Olmstead in places like Georgia, the home of Olmstead, we still have a long ways to go. So here we are, 30 years after the law, 21 years after a Supreme Court decision, and there's still waiting lists.
Yeah.
So what's wrong with this picture?
You're right. I think we've started a really good opportunity. We have really good laws behind us. Now we just got to make sure, it's almost like not really getting the politician involved this time, but getting the community to be involved, they're wanting to make it as accessible as possible because they see the value in making stuff accessible.
Well, you're always been good with people, and it's easy for you to establish relationships with people, and you're not one to sit inside and not come in contact with people. And so when it's all said and done, the answer is relationships.
Yeah.
I mean, you've surprised your family, you surprised your family's friends, and all of a sudden they're probably looking, I would think they're probably looking at access differently now that you're a young man than they did when, that kid who uses a wheelchair we'll get them in. Versus now they're going, can he roll in?
Yeah.
Can he use my bathroom? You know,
Yeah.
or they plan an event and they go, you know, in the past when you were a kid, they just they did what they need, but now they're going, maybe there's more than just doing that. Maybe we don't just need to drag them here, carry them there, but maybe we actually need to accommodate his
Yeah.
people needs. So that all changes with relationships and attitudes, and then you have, when you get attitude change, you get policy change.
So you've seen ADA, you've seen Olmsted, you've seen really 504 Rehab Act, really instrumental laws and regulations to help people with disabilities. But thinking in the future, like in the next 30 years, and I was listening to one of Kate Gaynor's interview, and she was saying that she does not envy the younger generation because she sees so many new barriers coming up. It may not be a physical barrier, but it may be some new barrier. What would you, in your all knowledge, what do you think will be not your, but like the next big barrier for the disability community?
I mean, you still have obviously employment, un and underemployment. So that one hadn't gone away, and it really hadn't changed much since ADA passed. You still have, you know, we still don't have equal access to healthcare. I mean, look what's happened with the pandemic. You know, we still have a variety of systemic issues, whether race injustices or whatever that need to be addressed. So you can look even within the disability community saying, okay, who tends to be forced into facilities and who tends to be not employed and who tends to have, you know, lack of fair housing, and you break that demographic down even more. So I think one is we just have a kind of a reckoning that we have resisted dealing with, that we have to deal with, and then we have the same old issues. I mean, you know, just because you say ADA required lifts on buses in public systems, then you had to work with over-the-road coaches, and then you had to work with companies that have travel companies. And now you go, okay, can I go out to the local RV dealership and find an accessible RV? You know, when I rent a car or rent a van from a rental company, I have to go to a niche or specialty van company and pay a bunch more than I would have to pay if I just rented a van from a rental company. So when you look at Uber or Lyft or whatever, you know, we don't have the same level of access to those transportation modes as other people. So it's, I could go, you asked me for one or two or three, and I can give you 8 or 10 real quick.
Hey, I totally agree with that. Our final questions, and it's an open-ended question. You're welcome to spend as long as you want. So, imagine you're talking to a young advocate named Charlie. What is one piece of advice you would want to leave to the next generation to give them understanding of their of what you're going to have to do, and then what you see as the next big push?
Yeah, I mean, at the end of last year, some of us were having to talk about what, you know, 2020 might look like. You know, what were the opportunities for 2020? And of course, we were talking about more around, you know, this November, and, you know, what would it, you know, different outcomes look like? How would people respond based on who gets elected, not just as president, but, you know, down ticket. And so we said, well, you know, it's going to be one of those transformative years. But that was before we even had the pandemic, or that was before we even had some of the recent protests, or that was before the the Gen Z recognize that they're 10% potentially of the voting population.
Yeah.
You know, I'm a baby boomer, then you got your millennials, then you got your X, but Gen Z has woken up now and said, hey, we potentially control 10%
Mm-hmm.
of all voters. And so it is an opportunity. I think you alluded to it earlier. We're learning things and we're not going back. So I think it's, you know, what's it like that old Nike thing, just do it.
Yeah.
And then it's like, just do it now, but understand that your personal experience makes you an expert.
Yeah.
Nobody's going to teach you that. You don't have to learn that first. Just know that your personal experience makes you an expert. And so just go out and be an expert.